Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, whatever time it is for you right now. Just know that you are locked in on To The Point with
Skip.
Man the King. You guys know where to find us by now. Tonight we have Robert Misovic, one of a great, actually brilliant mind. And Robert, this is why I asked you to come on today because I really do want to pick your mind on this one. I have a question for you. Like, Robert, you have been in the media for a very long time and is very successful, might I add that. Um, how can the media use their narration towards NBA athletes, either prop them up or bring them down? And are there any we talked about this a while ago about Kwame Brown. Are there any specific athletes that they put up or bring down, and how do they do it? Can you educate us, please?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this goes back to something I did in 2005. Um, I really didn't like Mike James. If you Raptor fans remember Mike James, and I just had a problem with this guy. Like, I didn't like his attitude, and it was just about like to kind of like change the narrative about him because he was on this tear and he was scoring like 20 plus points per game, and people were talking about how he's like this underrated gem. But if you change the narrative about him, you change the questions he has to answer, you sort of change the perception of him, you change the market for the player as well. So instead of talking about how great he was at scoring, which obviously he was a great kind of combo guard, I drew the narrative away from that and I said, well, how is he as a playmaker? How is he as a pure point guard? How is he a floor general? He's not making teammates better. And so you change that narrative. And so, of course, there are a lot of combo guards in the NBA who have a lot of value at that time. Jason Terry, guys like that, Jamal Crawford. There were guys in the NBA who were thriving in that Mike James role. But the minute you shift the narrative away from what he does well to what he doesn't do well, i.e., creating for others, making his teammates better, winning games, etc., you can sort of change the perception of how the player is addressed in the media, how they're talked about, how they're viewed, how they're ranked, their 2K rank. You can change all sorts of things, right?
Oh, yeah.
Subsequently, you can also change the kind of offers that player is going to get in the market from other teams, because obviously other teams don't want to bring in a scrub, right? So yeah, so I mean, you can change the narrative about, a player. So for instance, like someone like, I don't know, like Lonzo Ball, right? Like you can really change the narrative to like, oh, he hasn't lived up to expectations, and that totally takes away from all the wonderful things that he does well. You can say someone like Ben Simmons, oh, he can't shoot, but it's like it's taking away from everything else this guy does so well. He's like the starting point guard, he's top candidate for defensive player, but that gets pushed
against Washington. He played center on defense.
Exactly. How many players do you know in the NBA who can switch 1 through 5 defense and offense? Like that's
exactly
crazy, especially in today's NBA. So he's one of the most valuable players in the NBA, but all fans hear is, oh, he can't make a free throw, he can't make a jump shot. So, it's like you can change the narrative, right? Like you can do that. So it starts with how you write about the player, how you cover the player, the type of angles you want to pursue. Oh, he has off-court issues. Well, you can play that up. Or if you want to protect that player, like we did with Michael Jordan, like we did with LeBron, like there are certain players you just never keep about those guys because there's sort of I want to say like an unwritten rule that you're just not going to talk about that guy because this is your moneymaker, right? Like
exactly.
You have to protect that player, and also you don't want to lose your media credentials. So there's a lot of that goes on.
A valuable asset because, and Skip, how do you think the media has either destroyed or propped up certain players using their narratives and their talking points?
Well, just to feed off what Robert just said, I think what we get in the media a lot of the time is we get a lack of nuance, right? We just get really basic narratives. It's like this guy's a scorer, this guy is a franchise player, or this guy struggles at one specific thing. What we have to realize is that when there's a lot that goes into being a basketball player, there's a lot that goes into being a person. So if you really focus on one thing and one thing just keeps coming back up every single time, then that's sort of the narrative around that player will be that one thing. Whereas every player is a lot more complicated than we can handle in like a 1 minute like first take segment or something. So that's why I think it's really important to differentiate between major media and kind of maybe more minor media. I don't know how you'd put it exactly, but things like the blogosphere, where you might get those more nuanced takes. You might get people who are able to, like you said with Mike James. Well, I remember Mike James. He was just putting in buckets on a bad team. He was not contributing to winning at all. That was a terrible team. And it was like, oh, he scores 30 points a night. Great player. And the reality is, if you break it down, the Raptors were better when they moved on from Mike James because they had a more balanced team. So yeah, just in general, I think the major media can hit on very basic talking points. I think a really good example is KD going to Golden State. That became an issue
Can
because
we post that graphic about what Stephen A had to say about him?
yeah. So the thing with KD going to Golden State is everyone was like, oh, he's defecting. He can't beat him. He's got to join him. It's a pussy move. It's a weak move. It's a move that a loser makes to go to the winning side. And there was some validity to that criticism for sure. But what happened is it became this snowball effect where it was like all you ever heard was that KD was this guy who ran away from Oklahoma City. He couldn't take the heat. He had to go join a winning team. And it became a very negative spiral for him personally. And that's where we get the opposite side of this, which is players controlling their own media, which is KD going on Twitter with some burner accounts and attacking people, which probably wasn't the best move for him to make. But the fact is, the media landscape is really complicated right now.
And Max Kellerman saying that Kyrie Irving makes up his own narrative, but please go on.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, players can control their own narratives. It's just about how they do that. Some players do it by Danny Green making his own podcast. He can just interview himself every week, and he gets to get his narrative out there in the world. Whereas if you're going to go out and do it through burners, like Brian Colangelo, for example, that's maybe not the best way to do it, because then you just become more of a villain. Anyway,
isn't that what we're doing right now?
Exactly.
Okay, so Robert, what do you have to say? What Skip just said, man. Do you agree or disagree, or agree to disagree?
No, I agree.
Because I have one more question for you.
Because I would add to this, like, for instance, like if you remember the injury of Horry Garbajosa, right? That brutal injury that happened, right? And the Raptors kind of choked away in the first round of the playoffs, I believe, to the Nets that first year that they had 47 wins, right? And every bit of the narrative coming out of the Raptors side, which is obviously, fans listen to the Raptors, broadcasts, was only they had Horry Garbajosa. That one injury was what put them away, and that may or may not be true, right? I mean, he was a role player. But by the end of it, you would almost think that they were talking about Hakeem Olajuwon in his prime or something by the way that they were defining the impact that this guy had. Now, I'm not, downplaying the impact of that, but consider how this always happens, right? We have, for instance, this year, it was, oh, they're away from home. They're away from home. They're playing in front of fans. And it's like, yeah, there's an impact there for sure. But sure, like New Orleans did this once. I remember when they were playing in Oklahoma City after Hurricane Katrina, they didn't have the worst season ever or anything like that, So I think the team itself does a ton to, either, and there's a league kind of thing, like there's a league narrative of like, oh, we're going to push these guys up. We're going to make these guys the bad guys. We're going to, elevate these young players and make sure that everyone knows these are upcoming stars, and then we're not going to talk about certain guys. We're not going to talk about small market, stars. Like, I'm pretty sure that a lot of people have never seen Devin Booker play before last year's bubble, like really, like who gets, so it's like, it's really like, even when Vince was coming up, right? Like, how much were they pushing Vince Carter as the next Michael Jordan? Like that was a league narrative, right? But then each individual team has their own narrative. And I think that a lot of this has to do with selling things to fans, right?
Okay. See, now this Robert, thank you for saying that so much, because this brings me to my next question that I specifically want to ask you. Why has the media chosen to go after certain players to either prop them up or bring them down? is that due to the fact that the money that the media is making or the NBA is making, or coinciding? Because like you guys just did see on that graphic, Max Kellerman did say that, and Stephen A did say that's what it is. I have to ask you, is that really what it is? Because you're in the media, bro. We're not. We're just here doing a podcast, and so I want to ask you, why? Like, what's the process of the players that they choose?
I mean, for fans who watch the NBA, it's a big time distraction, right? So building up rivalries between teams, like that adds to fan engagement, right? Having talking points like the constant Jordan versus LeBron, this guy has beef with this guy said this thing about this guy's mother, this thing sells for whatever reason, right? But then there's also like you asked like the process of bringing someone up. I would say almost everything goes up so that one day it can go down, right? So we spend a lot of time.
Very well said.
For instance, 1999 to 2001, right? We spent a lot of time trying to convince the world, the NBA did, that Vince Carter was the next Michael Jordan, right?
Yep.
And then we spent from 2001 till 2015 basically slamming the guy for not becoming what we thought he should have become, right? And so it's like it's kind of spinning the narrative in a way, like and I think like there's always an angle involved. Like you have like a sort of like, oh, Vince isn't Kobe, right? So now we have Kobe scoring like 40 points and Vince is, sitting there with an injury. And so it's like, oh, well, this is the guy who, it's almost like professional wrestling, right? Like
that was the analogy I was going to bring up myself. Yeah,
the guy over. You know what I mean? It's kind of funny. Like
shout out to Andrew Reese. I'll see you this week on when we cover Bret Hart.
like think about it this way. Like, remember Allen Iverson when he crossed over Michael Jordan, right? In a weird way, that's the passing of the torch.
Yeah.
But Kobe guarding Mike in the All-Star game was like setting up the next generation by kind of connecting them to the past generation, right? So in a weird way now, like suddenly everyone's like, oh, Devin Booker's like a superstar, right? Why? Because he just beat LeBron, right? And they're kind of like setting it up. So you can see like the building blocks are in place now for.
So is he deserve? Do you think he's deserving of it or not?
Devin Booker?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I think he's amazing.
Okay, cool.
He's a really great player. But I will tell you this. Watch Devin Booker during these playoffs. And, if he has a bad game 7 or if he chokes away something or, he has a bad turnover, calls a timeout like Chris Webber did in Final Four, something like that. We'll start to hear does Devin Booker have the clutch gene? He's not really Kobe Bryant. Devin Booker's a bust. It's like, holy crap. How do we get here, right? And it's like we got here because there's a sort of old analogy of like you can if you were to put a frog in a boiling pot of water, it would jump out, right?
Yeah. But if you turn it up slowly,
water, and if you were to take a cold pot, a
cold pot of water, you're talking
cold
to
pot.
chefs.
You take a cold pot of water and you would have
and just turn it up. Yep.
The frog would literally melt to death. So it's kind of like the gradual shift, right? So
I would have no idea that it's doing it.
Yeah, exactly. You wouldn't accept that Devin Booker's a superstar right out of the gate, but slowly you can see the building blocks in place, and now you obviously wouldn't expect like the fall off when he eventually doesn't win a championship. But it's kind of like what they do with LeBron too, right? Like he's had a phenomenal career, but they'll bring up
show that graphic too.
Man, the Mavericks series and how he choked it away. Michael Jordan wouldn't have done that. So these are just all ways to sell.
It's narrative.
It's narrative. It's just building up the narrative, right?
So
I want to jump back.
I want to ask you, Skip, why? Oh, unless you want to respond back to Robert. You want to?
No, ask your question.
I wanted to ask you, why does the NBA pick and choose certain players to do this with? Is it due to the revenue?
Well, okay, yeah. So I think the main thing we have to understand is the NBA is a business. It's like any other business.
Yes.
All their media is advertising. All their media is PR to some extent. And that's kind of why I think that the wrestling analogy is really interesting, because I think what we do is we create these heels who who drive content and drive attention, and people watch. You like Brian, you watch LeBron because you hate LeBron. Other people are watching the Nets because they hate KD, they hate Kyrie, and there's all this antagonism that isn't necessary. There's already some antagonism just in the games themselves between the players. But what the media does is they take that and they amplify it 100-fold, and they find different stories, different reasons to hate players, different reasons, off the court reasons why a rivalry is even bigger than it actually is, kind of thing. When really, when it comes down to it, players are just going at each other because they want to win. And that's not quite as exciting as these pro wrestling narratives of, and then players feed into that sometimes, with, for example, Kyrie going off with his birthday vacation and
his words were, "I don't talk to pawns."
Yeah, so it becomes this kind of fishbowl where there's people become heels, and to some extent it's fair, but to some extent it's not totally fair, because I don't necessarily think you get into basketball because you want to play this role. Like, some guys get into basketball just because they're great basketball players and they don't have any interest in the media side of it. Obviously some guys play into it, but I think that's what I think.
I just think
it's like all three of us doing this. We're not in it for the show. We're in it for the context. You know what I mean? It's like those guys on the court, right? Sorry, Robert. Please.
Yeah, I mean,
continue.
you can spin anything any which way you want, right? So, for instance, right, like Kyrie is very unabashedly introspective, original. He's very smart, despite some of the stuff that he said is probably a little bit out there, flat Earth and all that stuff. But it's like, if you just keep talking about the flat Earth part, right, you might miss a couple of gems that he's actually dropped, which actually show a great deal of insight. Like, he's a family man. Like, there's a lot of good to say about Kyrie Irving, right? He was clutch.
Yes. Can I say something about that right there? I actually gained respect for him because just this past month, like, we all know I'm Muslim, and Ramadan, he was respecting that, and he wasn't eating or drinking. He was fasting like a good Muslim should, which I gave him respect for. I never knew until then. So
sure, yeah, there you go. So he's
like, I didn't know that about him.
He's got a lot of creativity in him, right? Like, there's an intelligence to that, right? So you could talk about that, right? I mean, for instance, LeBron has said some pretty dumb stuff, like some really stupid things in his life, right? But we don't harp on those. But if all we did was talk about those, we asked him questions about those all the time. If, like, say, for instance, like with Russell Westbrook, right? The media kind of toasts this guy, right? They talk about the validity of the doubles, if he's chasing stats, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say that the media wasn't protecting LeBron and the media was protecting Russell Westbrook, right? So you change the questions that you were asking the players, therefore you'd be changing the responses that you're getting from the players, right? All the time. And so the complete narrative changes. There are a lot of times when people bury stories about players. Like, there might be a story about somebody having an affair, somebody, has a paternity. You just don't hear about it because they won't write it. But if you have it out for a particular
Karl Malone is a good example of that.
Oh, Karl Malone is a great example of that.
Great example. Yep.
What this guy did, between, impregnating a teenager, refusing to pay. Like, I'm surprised this guy's a Hall of Famer. Honestly, I am. Like, what he did was so abhorrently, like it's flagrant, right? Like this is trash.
They buried that. They buried that because he went to the finals twice against Jordan.
Exactly. Like, a lot of NBA players are quite trash, like human beings, right? Like, just like any other person, right? You hear tons of stories about how they are to people, how they are to teammates, how they are to coaches, how they are to, ball boys, how they are to their families, and there's a lot of that stuff, right? But again, depending on who you're trying to cover and who you're trying to protect, right? Like, the NBA didn't protect Terrence Davis, for instance, right? So his alleged, abuse situation became so bad that that's all fans would talk about. Why haven't you waived this guy? Why haven't you waived this guy? And the next thing you know, like, you can't even go on.
I would actually argue that's a really good example of the thing I said earlier, because the major media, so to speak, like Sportsnet, TSN, they covered that story very briefly. And I think it was very much Twitter and the narrative off of the major outlets that really drove Terrence Davis being shipped out of town, because the fans themselves were creating this media environment of hostility towards Terrence Davis, which meant, like, he can't be on the team, even if the team itself wasn't throwing him under the bus.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. What do you think about LeBron refusing to shake hands with the Phoenix Suns when they got eliminated in the first round. Because here's the
What a
funny
horrible person.
dude, because honestly, think about it this way. He basically quit on his team 3 minutes into the game and before the game ended, right? And there was still technically
It was actually 6 minutes.
It took 15 seconds to come up the court on defense.
Yeah.
15 full seconds. The shot clock reset, right? Then he doesn't shake hands. He's done this numerous times, by the way, in his career. He did this against Boston when he was in Cleveland. He did this once in Miami when he was at Point. He did this, I think, in the first year with the Lakers. There was one time when I believe there was a clip of Kyle Kuzma literally pushing him to
go play defense. Yeah.
Pushed him into it's like, dude, it's your man. So it's like, if the media really had it out for LeBron, this would be the end of any GOAT debate.
Oh.
It would be like, Michael Jordan would never do this. He did this. And his entire career would be marked by the time he refused to shake hands, walked off the court, and quit on his team 3 minutes before the final in an elimination game. In a game that technically, mathematically, they could have still won. Although, yes, we will agree they probably would not have won. But, I mean...
Mathematically, yes.
There wasn't a lot of media coverage.
Probably.
And believe it or not, I went and watched Skip Bayless thinking this is the day this guy lives for. And even he didn't rip him. I found that fascinating.
Really? I'm sure he went off. He might have gone off after game 6. He went off on one of those. During that series, he went off.
He might have gone off in game 6 because LeBron left early and then came back. But Frank Vogel covered for him saying, oh, he had to go get treatment. Right? Do you see how they cover? Because
I play the narrative.
Yeah. Right. Because there was 5 minutes left in the game and he went to the locker room instead of supporting his teammates. And when asked after the game, Frank Vogel said, he had to get treatment on his ankle so that he can be ready for game. Really? 10 minutes? 10, 15 minutes was the big difference between, you know what I mean? And then obviously now I'm not hearing anyone in the media really talking about, hey, can we talk about this LeBron refusing to shake hands?
They don't want to.
But if KD did it, or if Kyrie did it, right? Kyrie stomps on the Celtics logo and it's like major news, right? But we don't hear a peep about LeBron. So it's like, so is the NBA, kind of like vested in, hey, this guy's our moneymaker. Let's not talk about him. Because Kwame Brown, ironically, we were talking about Kwame Brown 2 weeks ago. Kwame Brown just had Eton Thomas on, and they were talking about how they didn't cover certain European players and certain, international players, their struggles as much as American players, because they had a vested interest in those markets, in terms of expanding in those markets. So the business side of it said, hey, we know that Nikola Skidishvili is a bust, but he still has a following in his country. We know that Darko Milicic is a bust, but he still has a following in his country. And there's still, Detroit games are still being broadcast in Serbia because people are still tuning in to watch their player play, And so even like what we saw with Yuta Watanabe, right? Like this
number one selling jersey in Japan.
Yeah. And they chose to keep Yuta Watanabe, right, over O'Shea Brissett in a way, right? Like that was technically the 4-3 combo forward spot, and they chose one player over another, and one of them's a 22-year-old Canadian, the other one's an international player in Japan. And this is like, maybe the Raptors are also thinking, hey, we're a global team, we're a global brand, let's expand our market into Japan.
I think that was actually just because Brissett was hurt and he didn't come back very strong. It turned out to be an interesting decision, and obviously the Japanese marketing became another aspect of this team's season. Anyway, we should probably wrap this up.
Yeah, guys. Robert, I love what you're talking about with the GOAT debate, because we are going to get into that. You and I have spoken a lot about that, and I love to hear what you got to say, especially after what happened to LeBron. Skip, I love seeing your beautiful face. Robert, it's amazing to have you on here, man. I wish you nothing but the best. I'm still watching all your short films, man, and I think they're so crazy. You guys go out there, go Pensare. We'll leave the link for it. It's absolutely amazing. You guys can find myself, King Hussein, on all social media platforms. You guys can find Simon, Dougie J's on Twitter. Baseball season. It's his favorite time of the year. You guys can find us To The Point, Facebook, Instagram, To The Point Raps on Twitter, youtube.com/To The Point Podcast, or you could click, what was it? Skip and King, end quote. Type that in your search bar for YouTube. and you guys can find us, or just click on the link and enjoy what Skip had to say and what this intellectual, this G. I know you hate accommodations. I know you hate acclamations, Robert, but I got to tell you, you're a smart guy. And I hope you guys can understand what he had to say about this. Okay. So, on behalf of myself, Robert, and Skip, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night, and
Peace.